The gunshots echoed through the dusty streets of Bannack, Montana Territory, as Beatrice Langley fled for her life, the hem of her navy blue dress clutched tightly in her trembling hands. It was 1865, and the West was as wild as the stories told back east, perhaps even wilder. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat painful against her ribs as she ducked between buildings, grateful for the fading light of dusk that offered some concealment from her pursuers. "There she goes," a gruff voice shouted from behind her. "Don't let her get away." Beatrice had never meant to witness the bank robbery. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, stepping into the Bannack Territorial Bank just as three masked men were emptying the safe. One of them had turned, his cold eyes meeting hers through the holes in his mask, and she knew in that moment her life had changed forever. The outskirts of town approached rapidly as Beatrice pushed her body beyond its limits. The rolling hills and craggy mountains of Montana spread before her like a painting, beautiful and terrifying in their vastness. She had no plan, nowhere to go, just the desperate need to put distance between herself and the Hawkins Gang, notorious outlaws who had been terrorizing the Montana Territory for months. Her lungs burned as she scrambled up a rocky slope, the sound of horses' hooves growing louder behind her. Darkness was falling quickly now, a blessing she thanked God for as she searched frantically for somewhere, anywhere to hide. Then she saw a dark opening in the rocky hillside. A cave. Without hesitation, Beatrice darted inside, pressing herself against the cool stone wall just inside the entrance. The cave was deeper than she'd expected, extending back into blackness, but she dared not venture further in her panic. The sound of approaching riders made her breath catch in her throat. They were close, too close. Beatrice closed her eyes, silently praying as tears threatened to spill onto her cheeks. Suddenly, a strong hand clamped over her mouth, and she was pulled deeper into the darkness of the cave. Beatrice tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the calloused palm pressed firmly against her lips. "Quiet," a deep voice whispered in her ear. "Unless you want them to find you." Beatrice froze, her body rigid with fear. She could feel the solid warmth of a man behind her, holding her steady as the sounds of the outlaws drew nearer. "I think she went this way," one of the men shouted, his voice carrying easily to where they hid. "Check that cave," another responded. Beatrice's heart nearly stopped. The stranger's arm tightened around her waist, pulling her deeper into the shadows. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out a narrow passage to their left, barely visible in the dim light filtering in from the cave entrance. Without a word, the man guided her into the passage, moving silently despite his size. They squeezed through the opening just as lantern light illuminated the main chamber of the cave. "Don't see nothing in here," a voice called out, echoing against the stone walls. "She can't have gotten far." "Let's check further up the ridge." The stranger held Beatrice perfectly still, his breath warm against her hair as they waited in tense silence. Minutes passed that felt like hours before the light faded and the sounds of the men and their horses receded. Only then did the man remove his hand from her mouth, though he kept a steadying arm around her waist as if sensing her knees might buckle. "They'll pass," the cowboy said softly. "You're safe with me." For the first time, Beatrice turned to look at her rescuer. In the faint moonlight now filtering through cracks in the cave ceiling, she could make out a strong jawline, straight nose, and eyes that seemed to hold the darkness itself. He wore a worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, and a Stetson hat sat low over his forehead. Who are you?" Beatrice managed to whisper, her voice trembling almost as much as her body. "Name's Kieran Ambrose," he replied, his voice low and steady. "And you've managed to get yourself into a heap of trouble, Miss Beatrice." "Beatrice Langley," she replied automatically, years of proper upbringing asserting themselves even in this desperate moment. "And I didn't choose to get into trouble. I simply walked into the bank at the wrong moment." A ghost of a smile crossed Kieran's face. "Seems like bad timing can be deadly in these parts." He moved past her to peer out of their hiding spot, checking that the outlaws were truly gone. "You witnessed the Hawkins Gang robbing the bank, I take it?" Beatrice nodded, then realized he couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. Yes. They saw me and I ran. The reality of her situation suddenly hit her full force and she pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. They saw my face clearly. They'll keep looking for me, won't they? Kieran turned back to her, his expression grave in the dim light. The Hawkins brothers don't leave witnesses, Miss Langley. That's how they've managed to stay one step ahead of the law this long. What am I going to do? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. First we wait, make sure they're good and gone. He moved deeper into the cave, guiding her with a gentle hand on her elbow. There's a chamber back here where we can sit a spell. I've used this place before when tracking game. You're a hunter? Beatrice asked, grateful for any conversation to distract her from her fear. Kieran's laugh was soft and without humor. Of sorts, I track things for the territorial marshal sometimes. Right now I was tracking the Hawkins Gang when you flushed them out of hiding. Oh, shame colored her cheeks. I've ruined your hunt. No, madam, you've just changed it a bit. Now I've got one more thing to track away to keep you safe while still bringing those outlaws to justice. They reached a wider chamber where a small stream trickled down one wall, creating a pool of clear water before disappearing into a crevice. Kieran helped Beatrice sit on a relatively flat rock, then reached into his saddlebag, which Beatrice only now noticed he'd been carrying. You're lucky I was already camped nearby, he said, pulling out a small tin cup and filling it with water from the pool. Drink. You must be parched after all that running. Beatrice accepted the cup gratefully, only realizing how desperately thirsty she was as the cool water touched her lips. Thank you, Mr. Ambrose. Kieran's fine, Miss Langley. Then you must call me Beatrice. She handed the cup back, watching as he refilled it for himself. In the dim light filtering through from somewhere above, she could see him better now. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with dark hair that curled slightly where it fell below his hat. His face was weathered by the sun, but handsome in a rugged way that spoke of a life lived outdoors. How did you know I was in danger? She asked after a moment of silence. Kieran took a long drink before answering. I've been shadowing the Hawkins Gang for near on 3 weeks. I was watching the bank, same as them, but from a different vantage point. Saw you go in, saw the commotion when you ran out, figured they'd chase you, so I circled around to cut them off. He shrugged, as if it was nothing. Just happened to spot you heading for this cave. Well, I thank God you did, Beatrice said sincerely. I don't know what would have happened if, best not to think on that, Kieran interrupted gently. What's your story, Beatrice Langley? You don't sound like you're from Montana territory. Beatrice smiled despite herself. Is it that obvious? I'm from Boston originally. My father was a banker there. After he died last year, I decided to come west. My aunt lives in Bannack, she's the school teacher. Miss Edith? Kieran asked, surprise evident in his voice. Yes, you know her. Everybody knows Miss Edith. She's been teaching the children of Bannack for 15 years. Taught me my letters when I first came through as a boy. There was respect in his voice. She's a good woman. Yes, she is. Beatrice twisted her hands in her lap, thinking of her aunt's small house on the edge of town. She'll be worried when I don't return tonight. We'll get word to her somehow, but not yet. It's not safe. Kieran set down his cup and stood, his tall frame intimidating in the small space. We should try to get some rest. Dawn's only a few hours away, and we'll need to move once it's light. Move where? Beatrice asked, fear creeping back into her voice. Away from Bannack, at least for a while. The Hawkins Gang won't give up easily. They've killed for less than what you've seen. He must have noticed her expression because his voice softened. I know it's frightening, but I've dealt with men like them before. We'll figure something out. Kieran pulled a folded blanket from his saddlebag and handed it to her. It gets cold in these caves at night. Take this. I'll keep watch for a spell. Beatrice accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, bringing with it a wave of exhaustion. She was miles from home, hiding in a cave with a stranger, being hunted by killers. It was like something from one of the dime novels her father had forbidden her to read. Try to sleep, Kieran said, moving toward the entrance of their small chamber. I'll wake you if there's trouble. Despite her fear and the hard stone beneath her, exhaustion soon claimed Beatrice. Her last thought before drifting into an uneasy sleep was of the mysterious cowboy keeping watch in the darkness, and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Beatrice woke to the gentle touch of a hand on her shoulder. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings sending a spike of panic through her until her eyes focused on Kieran's face. "Sun's coming up," he said softly. "We should move while we have daylight." Beatrice sat up, her body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. The blanket fell from her shoulders as she reached up to smooth her disheveled hair. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noticing the shadows under his eyes. "I've gone longer without," he replied, offering her a hand to help her up. "Are you hungry?" As if in answer, her stomach growled loudly, causing a flush of embarrassment to color her cheeks. Kieran's mouth quirked in a half-smile as he reached into his saddlebag again, producing a strip of jerky and a small piece of hard bread. "It's not much, but it'll keep you going until we can find better." Beatrice accepted the modest offering with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Kieran nodded once, then turned to peer out of the cave entrance. "I scouted a bit while you were sleeping." "No sign of the Hawkins Gang, but that doesn't mean they've given up. They're likely watching the roads back to Bannack." "What will we do?" Beatrice asked between bites of the jerky, which was tough but surprisingly flavorful. "Head north for now, away from the main trails." "I know an old mining cabin that was abandoned last year when the claim dried up. It's about a day's journey on foot, but we should be safe there while we figure out our next move." "On foot? You don't have horses," Kieran shook his head. "I let mine go last night after I found you. Didn't want it giving away our position if the gang came back searching. We'll manage." The thought of walking all day through the rugged Montana terrain was daunting, but Beatrice nodded resolutely. She had no choice but to trust this man, and so far he had given her no reason to doubt him. They left the cave cautiously, Kieran going first and signaling for her to follow only after he'd scanned the surrounding area. The morning sun was just beginning to cast golden light across the rocky hillside, revealing a landscape both beautiful and forbidding. Beatrice's navy dress, practical by Boston standards but wholly unsuited for trekking through the wilderness, was already torn and dirty. She gathered the skirt as best she could, grateful at least for the sturdy boots she'd chosen to wear for her walk to the bank. "Stay close," Kieran instructed as they began to move through the sparse trees dotting the hillside. "Step where I step if you can." The day passed in a blur of physical exertion unlike anything Beatrice had ever experienced. They moved steadily northward, Kieran setting a pace that was challenging but not impossible for her to maintain. He seemed to know the land intimately, always finding the easiest path through difficult terrain, stopping occasionally to let her rest and drink from streams they crossed. During one such break, as Beatrice sat on a fallen log catching her breath, she studied her mysterious companion. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to wilderness, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, missing nothing. "How long have you been tracking outlaws?" she asked as he knelt by a stream to refill their single tin cup. "About 5 years now," he replied without looking up. "Before that, I rode with the Pony Express until the telegraph put us out of business, then did some scouting for the army during the early years of the war." "You weren't called to fight." The war between the states had ended only months ago, its shadow still long across the nation. A shadow crossed Kieran's face. "I did my part, saw enough killing to last a lifetime." He handed her the cup of water, effectively ending that line of conversation. "We should move on. Still have a ways to go before nightfall." As they continued their journey, Beatrice found herself growing curious about this man who had so suddenly become her protector. He was not particularly talkative, but he answered her questions patiently and occasionally asked some of his own. She told him about her life in Boston, her father's banking business, and her decision to come west after his death. "I suppose I was seeking adventure," she admitted with a rueful smile. "Though this isn't quite what I had in mind." "The West has a way of giving people more adventure than they bargained for," Kieran replied, helping her over a particularly steep section of trail. His hand was warm and strong around hers, and Beatrice was surprised by the fluttering sensation it caused in her stomach. "What about you?" she asked, hoping conversation would distract her from the unexpected feeling. "Do you have family somewhere?" Kieran was silent for so long that Beatrice thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost lost in the rustling of the pine trees around them. "Had a wife once, Sarah, and a baby girl on the way. Yellow fever took them both 6 years ago while I was riding for the express." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. After that, didn't see much point in staying in one place. "I'm sorry," Beatrice said softly, a lump forming in her throat at the pain evident in his words. Kieran nodded once, acknowledgement without invitation to discuss it further. They walked in silence for a time after that, each lost in their own thoughts. By late afternoon, Beatrice's legs were trembling with exhaustion, and blisters had formed on her heels despite her sturdy boots. She said nothing, determined not to slow their progress, but Kieran noticed her faltering steps. "Just a bit further," he encouraged, pointing to a ridge ahead. "The cabin's just beyond that rise." Beatrice nodded, summoning her last reserves of strength. When they finally crested the ridge, she nearly wept with relief at the sight of a small log cabin nestled in a grove of pine trees beside a clear stream. "It's not much," Kieran said, watching her face, "but it's solid and defensible." "It looks like paradise to me right now," Beatrice replied honestly. The cabin was indeed small, just one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame covered with a straw-filled mattress. A layer of dust covered everything, but the roof was intact and the walls solid. "The miner who built it did good work," Kieran said as he checked the windows and door. "He meant to come back when the snow melted, but took ill in Helena over the winter and never made it." Beatrice sank onto one of the chairs, her legs finally giving out. "How do you know all this?" "I helped bury him." Kieran's matter-of-fact tone spoke of a life where death was a frequent companion. He had no family to claim his things, so the cabin's just been sitting empty. While Beatrice rested, Kieran busied himself preparing the cabin for their stay. He swept the dust out, checked the chimney for blockages, and gathered wood for a fire. As dusk approached, he managed to catch 2 rabbits in snares he'd set near the stream. The simple meal of roasted rabbit was the most delicious thing Beatrice had ever tasted, or so it seemed to her hunger-sharpened senses. They ate in companionable silence as darkness fell outside, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. "Will they find us here?" Beatrice asked finally, voicing the fear that had been with her throughout the day. Kieran considered the question seriously before answering. "Not likely, at least not right away. We left no clear trail and this place is well off the usual routes, but we can't stay indefinitely. The Hawkins Gang is persistent, and they have connections all over the territory. What will happen to my aunt? Will they go after her? Possible, but not probable. They're more likely to watch her house, hoping you'll return." He prodded the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney. "Tomorrow I'll try to get a message to the marshal in Bannack. Let him know what's happened and that you're safe." "And then," Beatrice pressed, needing to know there was some plan beyond mere survival. Kieran met her gaze across the firelight. "Then we figure out how to use what you know to bring down the Hawkins Gang for good." The seriousness in his eyes sent a chill through Beatrice that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "What I know, but I only saw them for a moment. You saw their faces, didn't you? Even with masks, you might recognize something: eyes, a distinctive feature, a voice. Plus, you're a witness to the robbery itself." He leaned forward, his voice intense. "The territorial courts have been trying to build a case against them for months, but witnesses have a way of disappearing before they can testify." "You mean they kill them?" Beatrice said flatly. "Yes." There was no gentleness in his answer, which is why we need to be careful, very careful. The reality of her situation settled over Beatrice like a heavy cloak. She was no longer just a woman who had seen something she shouldn't. She was potentially a key witness who could help bring dangerous criminals to justice. The responsibility felt enormous. "I'll do whatever is needed," she said after a moment, her voice stronger than she felt. If my testimony can help stop them from hurting others, then I have to try. Something like approval flickered in Kieran's eyes. Get some rest, he said, gesturing to the bed. I'll take the first watch. You need rest too, Beatrice protested. You've barely slept. I'll wake you in a few hours to take your turn, he promised, though Beatrice suspected he had no intention of doing so. Too exhausted to argue further, she moved to the narrow bed, removing only her boots before lying down. The straw mattress was lumpy but infinitely more comfortable than the cave floor had been. Despite her racing thoughts, sleep claimed her almost immediately. When Beatrice woke, pale morning light was filtering through the cabin's single window. As she had suspected, Kieran had let her sleep through the night. He sat in a chair by the door, his rifle across his knees, looking as alert as if he'd had a full night's rest. You should have woken me, she chided gently, sitting up and smoothing her hopelessly wrinkled dress. You needed the sleep more than I did. He stood, setting his rifle carefully against the wall. I'm going to check my snares and scout the area. There's water in that bucket if you want to freshen up. After he left, Beatrice gratefully used some of the water to wash her face and hands, combing through her tangled hair with her fingers as best she could. Her reflection in a piece of broken mirror hanging on the wall showed a woman she barely recognized, her face smudged with dirt despite her efforts. Her usually neat blonde hair wild around her shoulders, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. You can do this, Beatrice, she told her reflection firmly. You have to. Kieran returned with 2 more rabbits and the news that there was no sign of pursuit, but that doesn't mean we can let our guard down, he cautioned as he prepared the animals for cooking. What's your plan? Beatrice asked, helping him by gathering kindling to restart the fire. There's a small trading post about 5 miles east of here. The man who runs it, Thomas Gray, is trustworthy. I'll go there today, see if I can get word to Bannack about what's happened. I'm coming with you, Beatrice said immediately. Kieran looked up from his task, his brow furrowed. It's safer if you stay here. Safer for whom? If something happens to you, I'll be alone in this cabin with no idea what to do or where to go. She crossed her arms, unwilling to back down. Besides, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 for spotting danger. For a moment she thought he would refuse, but then a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. You're a stubborn woman, Beatrice Langley. So my father often said, she replied, unable to keep an answering smile from her own face. They set out for the trading post after a breakfast of leftover rabbit. The day was clear and cool, the Montana sky a vast blue expanse overhead. Under different circumstances, Beatrice might have enjoyed the breathtaking scenery, the towering pines, the distant mountains, the meadows filled with late summer wildflowers. But the constant vigilance required as they moved through the landscape, always alert for signs of pursuit, kept her from fully appreciating its beauty. Kieran moved with the same quiet confidence as the day before, but she noticed he kept them to denser cover whenever possible and frequently stopped to listen and scan their surroundings. His hand often strayed to the revolver at his hip, a gesture that both reassured and unsettled her. Tell me about the Hawkins Gang, she said during one of their brief rest stops. What makes them so feared? Kieran's expression darkened. They're not just bank robbers. They run protection schemes in mining towns, deal in stolen cattle, ambush stagecoaches, and they're not afraid to kill. The 3 brothers, Luther, Samuel, and Jeremiah, have been operating in the Montana territory for about 3 years now. They've gathered a following of maybe a dozen men, all just as ruthless. How did you come to be tracking them? Beatrice asked, curious about this part of his story. A muscle twitched in Kieran's jaw. They killed a friend of mine, Ben Williams. He was a deputy marshal in Helena, got too close to their operation and ended up with a bullet in his back. His eyes, when they met hers, were hard with memory. I was deputized specifically to bring them to justice. I'm sorry about your friend, Beatrice said softly. Kieran nodded once, then stood. We should keep moving. The trading post is still a few miles ahead. Gray's trading post turned out to be a sturdy log building situated at a crossroads where 2 rarely used trails met. A corral behind the building held several horses, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney, signaling that someone was home. Kieran approached cautiously, signaling for Beatrice to stay slightly behind him. Thomas knows me, he explained, but he might have customers and we can't be too careful. The door to the trading post opened before they reached it, and a barrel-chested man with a gray streaked beard stepped onto the porch, a shotgun held casually in his hands. "That you, Ambrose?" he called, squinting against the sunlight. "It's me, Thomas," Kieran replied, raising a hand in greeting. "Came to see if you've got any coffee, been living off rabbit for 2 days. The bearded man laughed, setting his shotgun aside. "Well, come on in then, and bring your lady friend too." His shrewd eyes took in Beatrice's disheveled appearance with interest, but no judgment. Inside, the trading post was cluttered but clean, its shelves stocked with an eclectic array of goods from canned peaches to ammunition, bolts of fabric to bottles of whiskey. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated welcome heat, and a coffee pot sat atop it, filling the air with a rich aroma that made Beatrice's mouth water. "This is Thomas Gray," Kieran introduced as the older man poured 3 cups of coffee. "Thomas, meet Beatrice Langley." "Miss Langley," Gray acknowledged with a nod, "you look like you've had quite a journey." "That's putting it mildly," Beatrice replied with a weak smile, gratefully accepting the hot coffee. Once they were seated at a small table in the corner, Kieran explained their situation in low tones, keeping an eye on the door as he spoke. Gray listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grave. "The Hawkins Gang, eh?" he said when Kieran finished. "You've stepped in it this time, Ambrose." "Not by choice," Kieran replied grimly. "Can you get a message to Marshal Davis in Bannack? Let him know what's happened and that Miss Langley is safe for now." Gray scratched his beard thoughtfully. "I've got a boy who rides for me sometimes, delivering goods to outlying homesteads. I could send him to Bannack tomorrow with a message." "The sooner the better," Kieran said. "And there's something else. Miss Langley's aunt is Edith Langley, the schoolteacher in Bannack. She'll be worried sick." "Miss Edith?" Gray's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well now, that changes things. She taught my youngest boy to read when everyone else had given up on him. I'll make sure she gets word her niece is safe, though I won't say where exactly." "Thank you," Beatrice said sincerely. "I've been so worried about her." Gray waved away her thanks. "Least I can do. Now, what else do you folks need?" "You can't go back to Bannack yet, that's for certain. Supplies for a week or so," Kieran replied. "And any news you might have heard about the Hawkins Gang's movements." While the men discussed provisions and exchanged information, Beatrice sipped her coffee and tried not to let her exhaustion show. The events of the past 2 days felt surreal, like something from a fever dream rather than her actual life. Just 3 days ago, she had been helping her aunt prepare lessons for the children of Bannack, her biggest concern whether the new shipment of books would arrive before winter set in. Now she was hiding from killers, dependent on the protection of a man she barely knew. And yet, she realized with some surprise, she trusted Kieran Ambrose implicitly. There was something solid about him, a quiet strength that reassured her even in these dire circumstances. She found herself watching him as he spoke with Gray, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the firm set of his jaw, the capable hands that had guided her to safety. "Miss Langley," Gray's voice broke into her thoughts. "I was just saying to Kieran that you might want to pick out some clothes more suited to your current situation. Can't have you running through the wilderness in that fine dress." Beatrice looked down at her once neat navy dress, now torn and stained beyond repair. "Yes, that would be sensible." Gray led her to a corner of the trading post where a small selection of women's clothing hung on pegs. "My wife handles this part of the business," he explained. "She's visiting our daughter in Virginia City right now, but she keeps a good stock for the women who pass through." With Gray's help, Beatrice selected a practical outfit. A sturdy cotton blouse, a dark brown skirt of durable material that wouldn't show dirt easily, and a warm shawl for the increasingly cool nights. Gray also provided a pair of woolen stockings to replace her torn ones, and insisted she take a wide-brimmed hat to protect her fair skin from the Montana sun. "I'll just step outside and have a word with Kieran while you change," Gray said tactfully, closing the door behind him. Beatrice changed quickly, grateful to shed the ruined dress. The new clothes, while plain, were clean and well-made and far more practical for their situation. When she emerged from behind the makeshift screen Gray had set up for her privacy, both men turned to look at her. "Much better," Gray approved. "Now you look like you belong in the territory." Kieran said nothing, but something in his gaze as it traveled over her made Beatrice's cheeks warm. They left the trading post an hour later, laden with supplies. Dried meat, flour, coffee, ammunition for Kieran's rifle, matches, a small cooking pot, and various other necessities Gray had insisted they take. He had refused payment, saying only that they could settle accounts when the Hawkins Gang was behind bars. "You've made a good friend there," Beatrice observed as they made their way back toward the cabin, taking a different route than the one they had used earlier. "Thomas is one of the good ones," Kieran agreed. "Lost his eldest son in the war Confederate side but doesn't hold grudges against anyone who fought for the Union. Says there's been enough killing." A wise perspective. Beatrice adjusted the bundle she carried, trying to distribute the weight more comfortably. "Do you think his messenger will get through to Bannack safely? Thomas's boy knows these hills better than most. If anyone can avoid the Hawkins Gang, it's him." Kieran paused, turning to face her. "But even if the marshal gets our message, it might be a while before it's safe for you to return to town. Are you prepared for that?" Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I don't see that I have much choice, unless you're suggesting I should hide indefinitely rather than testify against them." "No," Kieran said quickly. "That's not what I meant. I just want you to understand what you're getting into. Once you testify, your life will be in danger as long as any of the Hawkins Gang remains free." "I understand," and she did, more clearly with each passing hour. "But I can't let fear stop me from doing what's right. They've hurt too many people already." Something like respect flickered in Kieran's eyes. "You're a brave woman, Beatrice Langley, or a foolish one," she replied with a small smile. "My father always said I had more courage than sense." "There are worse qualities to have in this territory." Kieran's own mouth quirked in an answering smile before he turned to resume their journey. They reached the cabin as dusk was falling, both weary from the day's exertions but relieved to have made contact with Gray and arranged for messages to be sent to Bannack. Kieran insisted on circling the area before approaching the cabin directly, checking for any signs that someone had visited in their absence. Finding none, they finally entered the small structure that had become their refuge. That night, after a meal far better than rabbit thanks to their new supplies, Beatrice sat by the fire mending tears in her old dress. She planned to use it as a nightgown, unwilling to sleep in her only set of clean clothes. "You don't have to do that," Kieran said, watching her from where he sat cleaning his rifle. "Gray gave us enough supplies that we could trade for more clothes if needed." "Old habits," Beatrice replied, not looking up from her stitching. "My father believed in frugality, even though we were comfortably situated. Waste not, want not was practically our family motto." Sounds like a practical man. He was. Sadness colored her voice. "After my mother died when I was 12, he raised me alone. Never remarried, though I know there were ladies in Boston society who would have been willing. He said once that a man only gets one great love in his life." She glanced up to find Kieran watching her with an unreadable expression. "Do you believe that?" she asked impulsively. "That we only get one great love?" For a long moment she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "I used to. After Sarah died, I couldn't imagine ever feeling that way again, but lately." He trailed off, his eyes meeting hers across the small cabin. Something passed between them then, something Beatrice couldn't quite name, but that made her heart beat faster in her chest. The air seemed suddenly charged with possibility, with unspoken words and feelings too new to acknowledge. The moment was broken by a sound outside, just the wind in the trees, but it made them both start. Kieran rose immediately, moving to the window to scan the darkness beyond. "Nothing," he reported after a tense minute, "but we should be more careful." "No fire tomorrow night, and we'll take turns keeping watch." Beatrice nodded, setting aside her mending. The reminder of their precarious situation had effectively dispelled the moment of connection, leaving her feeling oddly bereft. "I'll take first watch tonight," she offered. "You need rest too." To her surprise, Kieran didn't argue. "Wake me in 4 hours," he agreed, settling his hat over his eyes as he leaned back in the chair. Beatrice doused the fire until only embers remained, casting the cabin in near darkness. As she took up position by the window, rifle across her lap as Kieran had shown her how to hold it, she found her thoughts returning to their interrupted conversation. One great love in a lifetime. Her father had believed it, and perhaps Kieran had too. But the look in his eyes when he'd said lately that had spoken of possibility, of a heart healing and opening to new feelings. The realization that those feelings might be directed toward her sent a tremor of something like excitement through Beatrice's body. It was foolish, she knew. They were in danger, focused on survival with no certainty of what tomorrow might bring. And yet, she couldn't deny the growing warmth she felt in Kieran's presence, the way her eyes sought him out, the comfort she found in his steady strength. Outside, the Montana night was alive with sounds: the call of an owl, the rustling of wind through pine needles, the distant howl of a wolf. Inside, Beatrice Langley kept watch, her thoughts on the sleeping man behind her and the uncertain future that awaited them both. The days that followed settled into a cautious routine. Kieran ventured out each morning to check his snares and scout the surrounding area, while Beatrice maintained their small camp, preparing meals from their supplies and keeping watch. In the afternoons, they often sat together, Kieran teaching Beatrice more about surviving in the wilderness, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the forest, how to use the rifle he'd been carrying. "I never thought I'd need such skills," Beatrice commented as she practiced loading and unloading the weapon, her fingers becoming more confident with each attempt. "Most people don't until they do," Kieran replied, watching her progress with approval. "The West doesn't forgive the unprepared." On the 4th day of their hiding, Kieran returned from his morning scout with a grim expression that immediately set Beatrice on edge. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside the coffee she'd been preparing. "Riders about 3 miles south. 3 of them moving slowly like they're tracking something." He moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Could be innocent travelers, but you don't think so?" Beatrice finished for him, her heart beginning to race. "No. They're moving too methodically, checking every creek bed and stand of trees." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "We need to be ready to move if they come this way." Quickly, they gathered the essentials into Kieran's saddlebags: food, ammunition, the blanket, a water flask. Beatrice changed back into her old dress, now mended and somewhat cleaner, keeping the newer clothes packed away for later. "If we have to run, head north toward the mountains," Kieran instructed, pointing in the direction of the distant peaks visible from their doorway. "There's a line of caves about 5 miles that way. We can lose them in the rocky terrain." Beatrice nodded, committing the directions to memory. Her hands trembled slightly as she helped prepare, but her voice was steady when she asked, "Do you think it's the Hawkins Gang?" "Can't be sure, but it fits their pattern. They're thorough when they hunt." Kieran checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded. "We'll wait and see if they come this way. No sense running if we don't have to." The hours that followed were some of the most tense Beatrice had ever experienced. They took turns watching from the cabin's windows, alert for any sign of the approaching riders. Kieran had doused the fire and closed the shutters, making the cabin appear abandoned to casual observation. As afternoon waned toward evening, Beatrice was at the window when she saw movement at the edge of the trees surrounding their clearing. Her breath caught in her throat as she made out the shape of a mounted man, partially concealed by foliage. "Kieran," she whispered urgently, not taking her eyes from the figure. "Someone's here." He was beside her in an instant, his body tense as he peered through a crack in the shutters. "One of the riders I saw earlier," he confirmed in a low voice, "and where there's one." "The others will be nearby," Beatrice finished, her mouth dry with fear. As if summoned by her words, 2 more riders emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the clearing, effectively surrounding the cabin. Even from this distance, Beatrice could see the rifles they carried and the purposeful way they scanned the area. "It's them," Kieran said grimly. "I recognize Luther Hawkins, the one with the red bandana. How did they find us?" Beatrice's voice was barely audible, even to her own ears. "Doesn't matter now, we need to move." Kieran grabbed the saddlebags and his rifle, motioning for Beatrice to stay low. "There's a loose board in the back wall, behind the bed. We can slip out that way while they're still approaching from the front." Quickly but quietly, they moved the narrow bed frame away from the wall, revealing a section where the logs had been poorly joined, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if the lowest board was removed. Kieran worked it free with the blade of his knife, then peered out into the growing dusk. "Clear for now," he whispered. "I'll go first, then help you through." Beatrice watched as he slid through the opening, his movements silent despite his size. A moment later, his hand appeared, beckoning her to follow. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself through the narrow gap, grateful for her slender build. Kieran helped her to her feet on the other side, putting a finger to his lips to signal continued silence. They were at the back of the cabin, partially concealed by a woodpile and several large pine trees that grew close to the structure. In the distance, Beatrice could hear the sound of the men calling to each other as they approached the cabin from different angles. They had perhaps minutes before their escape was discovered. Moving as quietly as possible, Kieran led her into the dense forest behind the cabin, staying low and using the trees for cover. Beatrice followed his example, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or disturbing the forest floor. They had gone perhaps a quarter mile when a shout from behind told them their absence had been discovered. Kieran immediately increased their pace, no longer prioritizing stealth over speed. "They'll be on horseback," he said tersely as they moved. "We need to reach the rocky ground ahead before they catch our trail." Beatrice gathered her skirts higher, ignoring the branches that tore at her clothing and scratched her skin as they pushed through increasingly dense undergrowth. The terrain was rising now, becoming steeper and more difficult to navigate. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, crashing through the forest, shouted commands. The occasional whinny of a horse pushed too hard through difficult terrain. "They're gaining," Beatrice gasped, her breath coming in painful hitches as she struggled to keep up with Kieran's pace. "Just a bit further," he encouraged, reaching back to grasp her hand and help her up a particularly steep incline. They crested a ridge and Beatrice saw what he had been aiming for: a jumble of massive boulders and rock formations spread out before them, creating a natural maze that would be difficult for horsemen to navigate. "Through there," Kieran pointed. "Watch your footing." They descended into the rocky labyrinth, picking their way carefully over loose stones and around massive boulders. The light was fading rapidly now, making their progress even more treacherous, but also providing additional cover from their pursuers. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit faltered as the Hawkins gang reached the rocky terrain. Beatrice could hear cursing and the reluctant whinnies of horses being asked to navigate the difficult ground. "They'll have to dismount," Kieran said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. "That will slow them down." They pressed on through the growing darkness, Kieran now leading Beatrice by the hand to keep her from stumbling on the uneven ground. The terrain continued to rise, and Beatrice's legs burned with the effort of climbing, but fear kept her moving forward. After what seemed like hours but was probably less than one, they reached a narrow fissure in a towering rock face, the entrance to one of the caves Kieran had mentioned. "In here," he directed, helping her navigate the tight entrance. Inside, the cave opened up slightly, though it was nowhere near as spacious as the one they had first sheltered in. It was completely dark, the faint starlight outside not penetrating the interior. "Stay close to the wall," Kieran advised, his voice now just a whisper, "and keep absolutely silent." They pressed themselves against the cold stone, listening intently. For several minutes, all Beatrice could hear was the sound of their breathing and the blood rushing in her ears. Then, faintly, came the sound of voices and footsteps on stone, their pursuers still searching. "They're persistent," Kieran breathed, his mouth close to her ear. "Will they find us?" Beatrice whispered back, barely audible. Not if they value their necks. These caves are treacherous in daylight. In darkness, they're death traps to the unfamiliar. As if to prove his point, they heard a distant shout followed by the sound of falling rocks. Someone had slipped on the unstable terrain. Angry voices followed, then what sounded like an argument. Minutes stretched into an hour, then longer. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant, then faded entirely. Still, Kieran insisted they remain perfectly still and silent, taking no chances that the retreat might be a ruse to flush them out. The night grew colder as they waited, and Beatrice found herself shivering despite her woolen shawl. Without a word, Kieran shifted closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders to share his body heat. She leaned into his warmth gratefully, her head coming to rest against his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. "They've gone for now," he said finally, his voice still low. "But they'll be back at first light. We need to keep moving." "Where?" Beatrice asked, reluctant to leave the relative safety of the cave and Kieran's embrace, deeper into the mountains. "There are places up there where even the native tribes rarely go. We can lose ourselves for as long as necessary." The implications of his words sank in slowly. "How long do you think it will be before it's safe to return to Bannack?" Kieran was silent for a moment before answering. "I don't know. Depends on whether Gray's messenger got through to the marshal and what actions are taken afterward." His arm tightened slightly around her shoulders. "Are you having second thoughts about testifying?" "No," Beatrice replied without hesitation. "I'm just trying to understand what my life looks like now." "Changed," Kieran said simply. "There's no going back to what was before, but that doesn't mean what comes after can't be good in its own way." There was something in his voice, a warmth, a promise that made Beatrice turn her head to look up at him, though she could barely make out his features in the darkness. "Kieran," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say but feeling the need to speak. He silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "Later," he said softly. "When we're truly safe, we'll talk about everything. For now, we need to focus on surviving." Beatrice nodded, understanding the wisdom of his words even as her heart ached with unspoken feelings. "Then let's survive," she said with renewed determination. They rested for a few more hours in the cave, taking turns dozing while the other kept watch. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, they prepared to move again, eating a small portion of their remaining food and filling their water flask from a tiny spring that trickled down one wall of the cave. "Stay close and step exactly where I step," Kieran instructed as they prepared to leave their shelter. "The terrain gets more difficult from here." The day that followed was a blur of exhausting travel through some of the most challenging landscape Beatrice had ever encountered. They climbed steadily higher into the mountains, navigating narrow game trails that sometimes seemed to disappear entirely, forcing them to forge their own path through dense forest and over rocky outcroppings. Twice they spotted riders in the distance, searching the lower slopes, but each time they managed to find cover before being seen. Kieran's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable, as did his tracking skills, which allowed him to move them through the wilderness without leaving an obvious trail. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the air had grown noticeably thinner and cooler. Beatrice, despite her determination, was struggling to keep up, her city-bred body not conditioned for such exertion. "Just a bit further," Kieran encouraged when they stopped briefly to rest. "There's a place I know, a hidden valley where we can take shelter for a while." "How do you know these mountains so well?" Beatrice asked, grateful for the chance to catch her breath. A shadow crossed Kieran's face. "After Sarah died, I spent a lot of time in these hills, hunting, trapping. Mostly just trying to outrun my grief." He looked out over the expansive view of the Montana Territory spread below them. "Found it doesn't work that way, but I learned the land in the process." Beatrice reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his where it rested on a sun-warmed rock. "I'm sorry you had to go through that alone." Kieran turned his hand to grasp hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "We all walk our own paths," he said simply. "But sometimes those paths cross when we need them to." The look they shared then was filled with unspoken meaning, a connection deeper than their brief acquaintance should allow. It was broken only when a distant shout reminded them of their pursuers. "Come on," Kieran said, helping her to her feet. "We're almost there." They continued their ascent for another hour before the trail they were following opened suddenly onto a sight that made Beatrice gasp in wonder. Before them lay a small, hidden valley, nestled between towering peaks. A clear stream ran through its center, feeding a tiny lake of startlingly blue water. The valley floor was carpeted with grass and wildflowers, and at its far end, partially hidden by a stand of aspen trees, stood a small log structure. "What is this place?" Beatrice asked in amazement. "Trappers call it Lost Valley. It's hard to find unless you know exactly where to look." Kieran gestured toward the cabin. "That was built by an old mountain man named Jeremiah Thompson. He's long gone now, but he taught me how to find this place years ago." "It's beautiful," Beatrice breathed, taking in the peaceful scene before them. "And safe," Kieran added. "The Hawkins Gang won't find us here. Even if they knew about the valley, the trails leading to it are too difficult for men who don't know the mountains well." They made their way down into the valley, the tension of pursuit finally easing from their shoulders as they approached the small cabin. It was cruder than the miner's cabin had been, little more than 4 walls and a roof with a stone fireplace, but to Beatrice it looked like paradise. "We can stay here as long as necessary," Kieran said as they entered the simple structure. "There's game in the valley, fish in the lake, and wild berries in season. No one will disturb us." "How long do you think that will be?" Beatrice asked, setting down her bundle and looking around their new shelter. Kieran considered the question seriously. "Hard to say. If Gray's messenger got through to Marshal Davis, there might be a posse out looking for the Hawkins Gang already. But they're slippery, and they have friends in unexpected places. It could be weeks before it's safe for you to return and testify." "Weeks," Beatrice repeated, trying to absorb the reality of their situation. Strangely, the prospect didn't frighten her as much as it might have a few days ago. The thought of spending that time here in this beautiful valley with Kieran, it wasn't an unwelcome one. "Is that a problem?" Kieran asked, watching her face carefully. "No," she replied honestly. "I was just thinking that a few days ago, the idea of being stranded in the wilderness would have terrified me. Now it seems, I don't know, almost peaceful." The smile that spread across Kieran's face then was the most genuine she had seen from him, transforming his features and lighting his eyes. "The mountains have a way of changing your perspective," he said. "They've certainly changed mine more than once." That evening, they built a small fire in the cabin's fireplace and prepared a simple meal from their remaining supplies. Outside, the setting sun painted the valley in hues of gold and pink, creating a scene of such tranquil beauty that it was hard to believe they were fugitives. "Tomorrow, I'll show you how to fish in the lake," Kieran said as they sat by the fire afterward. "The trout practically jump into your hands." "I'd like that," Beatrice replied, smiling at the thought. "Though I should warn you, I've never fished before." "Never fished," Kieran feigned shock. "What do they teach young ladies in Boston these days?" "Latin, French, watercolor painting, and how to pour tea without spilling a drop," Beatrice answered with a laugh. "Useful skills in a drawing room, less so in the wilderness." "Well, Miss Langley, it seems your education is sadly lacking in practical matters." "Fortunately, you have an excellent teacher at your disposal." The teasing light in his eyes made Beatrice's heart flutter in a most improper way. "And what will this education cost me, Mr. Ambrose?" "Only your undivided attention," he replied, his voice dropping to a tone that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. "That," Beatrice said softly, "I believe I can manage." The days that followed were unlike any Beatrice had experienced before. True to his word, Kieran taught her to fish, laughing with genuine delight when she caught her first trout. He showed her which plants in the valley were edible, how to set snares for rabbits, how to start a fire with flint and steel when their matches ran low. In return, Beatrice applied her homemaking skills to their simple dwelling, creating a measure of comfort from limited resources. She fashioned a broom from twigs bound together, swept the dirt floor until it was smooth, and arranged their few belongings with an eye for order and convenience. They fell into a comfortable routine rising with the sun, working together to secure food and maintain their shelter, sharing stories by the fire in the evenings. Kieran spoke of his childhood in Ohio, his years with the Pony Express, his brief but happy marriage to Sarah. Beatrice told him about growing up in Boston society, her father's banking business, her decision to come west after his death. "Do you regret it?" Kieran asked one evening as they sat outside watching the stars emerge over the valley. "Coming to Montana." Beatrice considered the question seriously. "Even with everything that's happened, no, I don't think I do. If I had stayed in Boston, I would have led a safe, predictable life. Probably married some banker or lawyer my father would have approved of, had children, grown old in the same house I was born in." She looked up at the vast sky above them, filled with more stars than she had ever seen in the city. "It would have been a good life, but not an adventurous one." "And you wanted adventure," Kieran observed, his voice warm with understanding. "I wanted to really live," Beatrice clarified, "to make my own choices, see new things, maybe even make a difference somehow." She glanced at him shyly. "I never expected it would involve outlaws and hideouts in the mountains, but life rarely turns out exactly as we plan, does it?" "No," Kieran agreed, his eyes reflecting the starlight as they met hers. "Sometimes it turns out better." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. They had grown closer with each passing day, their initial wariness giving way to deep trust, and something more, something neither had yet put into words, but that hummed between them like electricity before a storm. "Kieran," Beatrice began, gathering her courage. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You risked your life to save a stranger, and you're not a stranger anymore," he interrupted gently. His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that made her breath catch. "And I didn't just risk my life for you. I found something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Kieran leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Beatrice responded without hesitation, her free hand rising to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaven cheek beneath her palm. When they finally broke apart, Kieran rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said softly. "After Sarah died, I closed that part of myself off. Didn't think I had the right to be happy, or maybe I was just afraid to risk losing someone again." "And now," Beatrice asked, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "Now I'm afraid of something else entirely," he admitted. "Afraid of not telling you how I feel while I have the chance. Life's too uncertain out here to waste time being cautious with your heart." "Then tell me," she encouraged, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Kieran pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his own gaze serious and intent. "I love you, Beatrice Langley. It happened faster than I ever would have thought possible and in the most unlikely circumstances, but there it is. I love your courage, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you've faced every challenge without complaint, the way you've made this rough cabin feel like a home." Tears spilled onto Beatrice's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too, Kieran. I think I began falling for you that first night in the cave, when you said you're safe with me, and I believed it with my whole heart." Their second kiss was deeper than the first, filled with the promise of all they might become to each other if given the chance. When they finally returned to the cabin, hand in hand beneath the canopy of stars, Beatrice felt as though her life had somehow both changed completely and finally found its proper course. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Beatrice's life. Despite the circumstances that had brought them to the hidden valley, despite the uncertainty of what awaited them beyond the mountains, she and Kieran found a kind of contentment in their simple existence together. They spoke often of the future cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Kieran spoke of a small ranch he hoped to establish once his work as a deputy marshal was complete, somewhere with good grazing land and a view of the mountains. Beatrice shared her dream of opening a proper school in one of the growing towns of the territory, where children could receive an education that would prepare them for the developing West. "We could do both," Kieran suggested one evening as they lay together beneath a homemade quilt Beatrice had fashioned from their spare clothing. "A ranch near enough to town that you could teach, but with enough land to raise horses and cattle." "You make it sound so simple," Beatrice said, nestling closer to his warmth. "Not simple," he corrected, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "but possible. Once the Hawkins gang is brought to justice and you've given your testimony, we can start building that life together." The reminder of the reason for their exile cast a momentary shadow over their happiness. Though they rarely spoke of it, both were aware that eventually they would need to leave their sanctuary and face the dangers that awaited them in the outside world. That moment came sooner than either expected. On a crisp morning in early autumn, as they were returning from checking Kieran's fishing lines at the lake, they spotted smoke rising from a campfire at the valley's entrance, a campfire that hadn't been there the day before. "Get to the cabin," Kieran said instantly, his hand going to the revolver he still wore despite the peaceful weeks they had spent in the valley. "Gather only what's essential. We may need to leave quickly." Heart pounding, Beatrice hurried to obey, her mind racing with possibilities. Had the Hawkins gang somehow found them? Or could it be someone else, perhaps even the marshal, with news that it was safe to return? She had just finished gathering their few valuables into Kieran's saddlebags when he entered the cabin, his expression grim but not panicked. "It's Thomas Gray," he reported, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "And he's not alone. Marshal Davis is with him." The marshal, relief washed over Beatrice. "Then it's over. They've captured the Hawkins gang." "Not exactly." Kieran sat heavily on the edge of their makeshift bed. "According to Thomas, they've captured two of the brothers, Samuel and Jeremiah. Luther is still at large, along with three of their most loyal men. But that's good news, isn't it? That means they're weakened, less dangerous." "Luther was always the most ruthless of the three," Kieran said, his expression troubled. "And now he'll be desperate, which makes him even more dangerous. The marshal wants to get you to Helena right away to testify against the two they've captured before Luther can interfere." "Helena." Beatrice repeated, trying to absorb this sudden change in their circumstances. "But that's days away." "A hard ride, but the marshal brought horses for us. We'd leave immediately." Kieran reached for her hands, holding them tightly in his own. "Beatrice, I won't lie to you. The journey will be dangerous. Luther will be looking for you, and he won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in his way. But if I don't testify, the two they've captured might go free," Beatrice concluded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Yes, and more people will be hurt." Kieran's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "It has to be your decision, though. No one would blame you if you chose to stay hidden." Beatrice lifted her chin, her resolve firming. "I made my choice weeks ago, Kieran. I won't hide while others suffer from the Hawkins gang's brutality. If my testimony can help put two of them behind bars, then that's where I need to be." Pride and worry warred in Kieran's eyes as he gazed at her. "I was afraid you'd say that," he admitted. "And even more afraid that I would admire you for it." He released her hands to cup her face gently. "Whatever happens, I'll be by your side. You have my word on that." "I know," she said simply, turning her face to press a kiss into his palm. "And that's all I need to face whatever comes next." They packed quickly, taking only what was essential for the journey. Outside, they found Marshal Davis, a weathered man with a silver mustache and hard eyes that softened slightly when Beatrice approached, and Thomas Gray, who greeted them with obvious relief. "Glad to see you both in one piece," Gray said, tipping his hat to Beatrice. "Your aunt's been beside herself with worry, Miss Langley, though the letters we managed to get to her helped some." "You got messages to Aunt Edith?" Beatrice asked, touched by this evidence of Gray's reliability. "Said I would, didn't I? She's a strong woman, your aunt. Been helping the marshal gather evidence against the Hawkins gang, talking to folks who were too scared to come forward before." "We owe you a debt, Thomas," Kieran said, clapping the older man on the shoulder. "Consider it repaid by bringing these outlaws to justice," Gray replied seriously. They've terrorized honest folk for too long. The marshal, after ensuring Beatrice was indeed willing to testify, outlined their plan. They would travel hard for Helena, taking indirect routes and avoiding main trails. Two other deputies were waiting at the base of the mountains, providing additional protection for their journey. It won't be comfortable, Davis warned Beatrice, his eyes assessing her practical clothing and sturdy demeanor with approval. But if all goes well, we'll be in Helena within 3 days. I'll be fine, Marshal, Beatrice assured him. I've learned a great deal about endurance these past weeks. The journey that followed tested that endurance to its limits. They rode from dawn until dusk each day, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the horses. Nights were spent in hastily established camps with watches set and fires kept to a minimum to avoid detection. Beatrice, despite her determination, found the pace grueling, but she never complained, drawing strength from Kieran's steady presence beside her. On the second day, as they crossed a high meadow, one of the deputies spotted riders following their trail. Though they couldn't be certain it was Luther Hawkins and his remaining men, they took no chances, increasing their pace and taking an even more circuitous route through difficult terrain. By the third day, Beatrice was swaying in her saddle with exhaustion, her body aching from the unaccustomed hours on horseback. Kieran rode close beside her, his concern evident in the frequent glances he cast her way. "Not much further," he encouraged as they crested a rise to see the distant rooftops of Helena spread out below them. "You've done amazingly well, Beatrice." She managed a tired smile in response, too weary for words but determined to complete their journey. They were within an hour's ride of the town when disaster struck. As they descended through a narrow pass, shots rang out from the rocks above, sending them scrambling for cover. Beatrice found herself pulled from her horse and pushed behind a large boulder by Kieran, who drew his revolver in one fluid motion. "Stay down," he ordered as more shots echoed around them. The marshal and his deputies returned fire, their experienced marksmanship forcing the ambushers to keep their heads down. Thomas Gray, despite his age, proved equally adept with a rifle, providing covering fire from his position behind a fallen log. "It's Luther," one of the deputies shouted. "I recognize that red bandana. He's got at least 3 men with him," the marshal called back, reloading his revolver with practiced speed. "We're outnumbered, but we've got better positions." The firefight continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Beatrice, huddled behind the boulder with Kieran's body partially shielding hers, prayed as she had never prayed before, not just for her own safety, but for all those risking their lives to protect her. A sudden cry of pain made her look up to see one of the deputies clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Almost simultaneously, there was movement among the rocks above as Luther Hawkins and his men began to retreat, realizing their ambush had failed. "They're running." Gray shouted. "Not for long," Marshal Davis replied grimly. "Ambrose, you and Gray get Miss Langley to Helena. Johnson and I will pursue Hawkins." "Marshal, that's not wise," Kieran protested. "He's still got 3 men with him." "And I've got deputies waiting in Helena who can join us once Miss Langley is safely delivered," Davis countered. "This ends today one way or another." There was no time for further argument. The wounded deputy was helped onto his horse, and the marshal divided their party as he had indicated. Kieran, clearly unhappy with the plan but unable to offer a better alternative, helped Beatrice remount and positioned himself protectively beside her. "Keep your head down and ride fast," he instructed as they prepared to leave the shelter of the rocks. "We're making for Helena as directly as possible now." The final leg of their journey passed in a blur for Beatrice. They rode hard, not daring to stop even when her body screamed for rest. The wounded deputy, pale but determined, kept pace with them despite his injury. Gray led the way, his knowledge of the terrain once again proving invaluable as he guided them along the fastest route to town. It was nearly dusk when they finally entered Helena, the bustling mining town a shock to Beatrice's senses after weeks in the wilderness. People stopped to stare as they rode down the main street, their appearance dusty, disheveled, and clearly in haste, drawing curious and concerned looks. Gray led them directly to the territorial courthouse, a substantial brick building that also housed the marshal's office. Inside, they were met by a flurry of activity as the remaining deputies were briefed on the situation, and a party was quickly formed to ride to Marshal Davis's aid. Kieran, torn between his duty to pursue the outlaws and his promise to stay by Beatrice's side, looked to her for guidance. "Go," she said, reading the conflict in his eyes. "The marshal needs you more than I do right now. I'll be safe here." "I promised I wouldn't leave you," he reminded her, his hand warm on her arm. "And you're not," she assured him, covering his hand with her own. "You're helping finish what we started. I'll give my statement to the judge while you're gone and be waiting when you return." After a moment's hesitation, Kieran nodded, bending to press a swift kiss to her forehead. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised. "Stay with Gray and don't leave the building until I return." "I will," she promised. "Be careful, Kieran. I love you." "I love you too," he replied, his eyes conveying everything words could not. Then he was gone, joining the deputies mounting up outside. The hours that followed were among the most anxious of Beatrice's life. She gave her statement to the territorial judge, a stern but fair man who listened attentively to her account of witnessing the bank robbery and the subsequent chase. Thomas Gray stayed by her side throughout, his steady presence a comfort in Kieran's absence. Night fell, and still there was no word from the marshal's party. Gray insisted Beatrice try to rest, arranging for a cot to be brought into the judge's chambers where she could lie down. Though she doubted she would sleep, exhaustion eventually claimed her, and she drifted into an uneasy slumber. She was awakened by the sound of commotion in the outer office, voices, footsteps, the opening and closing of doors. Sitting up quickly, she smoothed her hair and straightened her clothing, heart pounding with anxiety and hope. When the door opened, it was Marshal Davis who entered first, his face weary but triumphant despite a bandage visible on his arm. Behind him came Kieran, and the sight of him dusty, tired, but wonderfully alive brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. "It's over," the marshal announced without preamble. "Luther Hawkins is dead. His men have been captured and are on their way to cells as we speak." "Dead." Beatrice repeated, trying to absorb the news. "He wouldn't surrender," Kieran explained, moving to sit beside her on the cot. "Chose to go down fighting rather than face the hangman's noose. The important thing," Marshal Davis continued, "is that the Hawkins gang is finished. Between your testimony against the two brothers already in custody and the evidence we've gathered, they'll never terrorize this territory again." The realization that it was truly over, that she was safe, that the outlaws who had forced her into hiding were either dead or behind bars, washed over Beatrice in a wave of relief so profound she felt light-headed. "What happens now?" she asked, looking from the marshal to Kieran. "Now," Davis said with a rare smile, "you're free to go back to your life, Miss Langley, or to start a new one, as the case may be." His knowing glance between her and Kieran suggested he was well aware of the connection that had formed between them. "I'd like to see my aunt first," Beatrice said, returning the marshal's smile with a tired one of her own. "She must be worried sick." "We sent a telegraph to Bannack as soon as we arrived," Gray informed her. "Miss Edith knows you're safe and will be returning soon." "Thank you," Beatrice said sincerely, "for everything." The marshal and Gray tactfully withdrew, leaving her alone with Kieran. As soon as the door closed behind them, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if he never intended to let go. "I was so afraid," he admitted, his voice muffled against her hair, "when the shooting started and then having to leave you. But you came back," she reminded him, pulling back just far enough to look into his face. "Just like you promised. I'll always come back to you, Beatrice." His eyes, warm and sincere, held hers. "If you'll have me, that is. If I'll have you," she repeated with a small laugh. "Kieran Ambrose, I've been planning our future together for weeks now. You don't get to back out." The smile that spread across his face then was like the sun breaking through clouds. "In that case, Miss Langley, I have something to ask you." He took her hands in his expression growing serious despite the joy in his eyes. I know it's fast and maybe not the most romantic timing, but I've learned not to waste time when it comes to matters of the heart. Will you marry me? Yes, Beatrice answered without hesitation, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Yes, I will marry you. Their kiss was a promise, a celebration, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, Kieran rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. When we first met, he said softly, all I could offer you was safety from the outlaws. Now I'm offering something more, a life together with all its joys and challenges. I accepted the first offer, Beatrice reminded him, her hands coming up to frame his face. Did you really think I'd refuse the second? 1 month later, on a crisp autumn day in Bannack, Beatrice Langley became Beatrice Ambrose in a simple ceremony performed by the local preacher. Her Aunt Edith wept happy tears. Thomas Gray stood as Kieran's best man, and half the town turned out to celebrate the union of the schoolteacher's niece and the deputy marshal who had brought down the notorious Hawkins Gang. The following spring, they established their home on a promising piece of land 10 miles outside of Virginia City, where Kieran began raising horses while Beatrice opened a small school that quickly gained a reputation for excellence. Children rode for miles to attend, and their parents often stayed for the community gatherings that became a regular feature of life at the Ambrose Ranch. On warm summer evenings, Kieran and Beatrice would sit on the porch of their modest but comfortable home, watching the sun set over the mountains that had both threatened and sheltered them during those fateful weeks that had changed their lives. You ever think about it? Beatrice asked one such evening, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. That first night in the cave when you told me I was safe with you? Often, Kieran admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. Though I never imagined then where it would lead us. To the best kind of adventure, she said, smiling up at him. One we're sharing together. Inside, their infant daughter named Sarah Edith after both Kieran's first wife and Beatrice's, aunt slept peacefully in her cradle. Outside, the Montana wilderness spread before them, no longer a place of danger but the backdrop for the life they were building together. And in the hearts of both Kieran and Beatrice Ambrose was a love that had been forged in adversity but would endure through all the seasons of their lives. You're safe with me, Kieran murmured, echoing those words from long ago as he bent to kiss his wife. Always and forever. And in his arms, surrounded by the life they had created together, Beatrice knew that it was true. They had found in each other not just safety, but the rarest and most precious treasure of all, a love strong enough to withstand whatever challenges might come their way in the wild and beautiful land they now called home.